As far as my value systems, I adhere mostly to the moral ideas presented by secular humanism and Roman Stoicism. My virtues are even more real, since they are presented in life and not dependent upon an afterlife.
Catholic views of sexuality, of homosexuality, of women's rights, things like that I couldn't get behind. And so it's very much the politics of the church that I didn't agree with. And so I decided that I had to separate myself from that.
My values haven't changed much, just my ability to analyze the situation.
I think the best thing that we can do is find others that share our value system and engage and build communities with them. It's a small step that goes a long way after leaving the faith.
Welcome to Forsaking Faith, where we tackle these and other thoughts through discussion and contemplation.
This is Heather Bailey and Christine Goodrich. Our podcast explores the journey from fundamentalist Christianity to non-belief by examining the deep and nuanced effects of deconversion.
While some ex-Christians focus on the negative aspects of their past, we want to emphasize how leaving Christianity is a complicated process that brings both pain and joy. It is both loss and liberation. While we lose structure, community, and stability, we gain empowerment and agency.
We want to create a space for thoughtful discussion in this spirit, and we invite you all to join us.
Today, we will be discussing the changes in our value system as a result of our deconversion. In this episode, both of us talk about some of the challenges that come with deconverting in relation to value systems. So both of us discuss how challenging it is to reconstruct our value systems after deconversion. And Christine specifically talks about how much her Christian values provided stability for her. And so she discusses the emotional impact that she had when she was confronted with the reality that there are so many different options now, and so she talks about how she had to start from scratch in developing her value codes. And then she talks about how, and this is the part I think is particularly interesting and insightful, she talks about how her strongest values now are actually rooted in her Christian experience, even though she no longer believes in a Christian God.
Heather emphasizes how she also lost that sense of stability. And she acknowledges that that's something that is part of her daily life. And so it's difficult to navigate now. But that she's found her real values to be honesty, integrity, authenticity, and vulnerability. And she's discussed how these values are actually rooted in her Christianity, even though she's used secular ideals to bring those things together to what she believes now.
One of the most difficult things to contend with for me is when I did lose, my value system that I had as a Christian fundamentalist. I didn't quite know where to start with rebuilding my value system. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about what I did afterwards first, and then I'm going to circle back and talk about some of the ways in which I experienced a loss in my value system. And so try to capture, that experience from both sides. When I started to figure out and ask myself, what is my value system now, it certainly was challenging, because one of the things that you have, or certainly I had as a Christian fundamentalist growing up, was a sense of stability when it came to my value system. And it required less intellectual work because I could rely on an authority figure like my pastor, also my parents, certainly. And I kind of was just able to ingest whatever they told me and then regurgitate, those values without really having to question them or go through that intellectual process. So I come from a Christian fundamentalist home, so I had those values instilled in me very strongly at all different areas in my life. It wasn't just when I went to church, but in my home as well. So one of the ways in which certainly one of the things that was a loss for me was this loss of stability. And when I did lose my faith and go through that process of deciding I wasn't going to be a Christian anymore, I felt very unmoored, untethered for a while, and didn't know how to redevelop a stable ethical code. And I wanted that stability. And I think that that's probably part of the irony and the complexity in coming from a Christian fundamentalist home, is that stability is still really important to me. So it's interesting. I've rejected the tenets of Christianity, but I still really want that stability. And it's not necessarily the case for friends of mine who have grown up in atheist, or secular humanist homes. They're a lot more comfortable in general with ambiguity and when it comes to ethical codes. So obviously ambiguity is important to some extent, but I also did want to develop some basic tenets that could moor me. And obviously I realized that they needed to come from me now instead of from this outside authority figure. And so I began to develop my ethical tenets, my ethical code. And to be honest, it's still a work in process. So I have not fully figured it out yet. I have not developed all of them yet. It's something I'm actively working on. But there are two that I have and definitely are core values of mine now that I've worked through. And those are honesty and authenticity. And they're obviously related, but slightly separate. So for me, honesty is about always being truthful, even if it's not pleasant or not something that someone wants to hear necessarily. And you can be truthful in a kind way, but I really believe in being honest with people about how I'm feeling, especially if they ask for my advice. And so with rare exceptions, but generally speaking, that's really important to me. And to go along with that is integrity, right? So I also really believe in staying true to my word. If I tell a friend that I'm going to follow through on something, then I follow through on it. If I tell a friend that I feel a certain way, my actions need to match with what I'm saying. And so I really, and I'm not saying I'm perfect at this, but I really embrace this as a kind of goal of mine. This is what I want to strive, the kind of person that I want to strive to be. I want to be the person that if somebody knows that my word is worth something.
I'm interested, Heather, in how you built up to that, right? So I understand that it's a value, but where did it come from? Where is it rooted?
Yeah, so that's the interesting irony and complexity in this whole thing, is that I've figured out that I think this emphasis on authenticity, honesty, integrity, authenticity is the other part of this. Just being a genuine person, being vulnerable and honest with who I am as a person, including my weaknesses, and that's another part of this ethical code for me. One of the things I've realized is that I think that's very much rooted in my Christian background. So authenticity is something that I've really worked through, because especially in the past couple of years, because I've had some really bad experiences and it's caused real conflict. So that's part of where I've developed this ethical code, and it is really important to me. And I want to emphasize again what authenticity means, because it's related to my next point that I want to make about how it's related to Christianity. For me, authenticity is about being vulnerable, being willing to be open about who and what I am, even though it's not always pleasant and beautiful and put together. And that comes from my Christian background. And one of the things that I think Christianity often gets criticized and has a bad reputation in, obviously pop culture, there's lots of parodies of Christianity that involve Christians being really fake And I'm not saying that's not true in many cases. It is, and there is that strain in the church, unfortunately. But in the church that I grew up in, actually, that Christine and Christine is going to talk more about this too, because she feels similarly. We really didn't experience it that way. Our church actually was very good at, now they had very strong views about what was right and wrong, but they also advocated for being honest about your weaknesses. And so even our pastor was really a really open person. He would quite often talk about, as part of his conversion narrative to Christianity, he would talk about all of the, negative things that he did when he was younger. And even though sin, we had a clear concept of sin and that it was bad, but people in our lives were open about the fact that they sinned, and that they were weak. So I think that's something that's really beautiful about Christianity. And one of the other things, and this also relates to both a value that I've in some ways rejected, but also there's a part of it that I still like, which is when it comes to gender, ideas of gender in the church, right? Generally speaking, that's something that I have a lot of issues with in terms of how I was raised. I was raised in a church and in a family that had a clear concept of traditional gender roles, especially in terms of the division of household work and in terms of characteristics, right? So we had I was taught a very essentialist way of viewing gender. So, women are inherently these traits and men are inherently, these traits. And I have a big issue with that. That's something that I have a lot of do have a lot of resentment about a lot of that, and I have largely rejected that part of my background. But what's so ironic to me is that while the Christian fundamentalist church, especially our church, reinforced these traditional gender roles in so many different ways, that men are strong and the providers, and women are emotional and caring and compassionate, all these things. There's one way in which that doesn't quite hold up, which is when it comes to this idea of vulnerability. And one of the things that our church did really well is that men had a space in which they could be emotionally vulnerable. And because it's part of the Christian narrative, right? Like, this idea that you admit that you're a sinner and you admit that you've made mistakes and you need, as a man, you need help. You need God's help. And so in a weird, strange, ironic way, that one part of our Christian fundamentalist background, I think is really beautiful and really positive and could and does add value to our culture, because our culture is still really invested in a idea of toxic masculinity, and this idea that men can't and shouldn't be vulnerable in those ways. And
we had men cry in front of church on Sundays, just like crying out to God, which seems silly, but just that vulnerability was really pure. And I definitely want to reinforce what you said. We definitely saw something beautiful in our church, I think.
Yes. Yeah. And it's interesting. And this will probably be a whole nother podcast topic where Christine and I talk about romantic relationships and how this journey has affected that part of our lives. So I'll just say briefly here that has had a really big impact on my romantic life, because I continue to really value that in people that I date. And that can be challenging sometimes. I encounter lots of men who are not Christians, many of them who were raised in a secular home, but who still have some of those traditional masculine ideas of, I'm going to be really reserved and I'm not going to admit that I'm weak. And I find that frustrating. So, and the people that I'm attracted to are people who let me see that vulnerability. So it certainly has carried over. So it's a work in progress, but that's essentially where I'm at right now. And I bet more about gender values, gender roles more generally. I really embraced that growing up. So I actually really, the women who I valued and admired in our church were always like these very traditional, got married young, had a lot of kids, cooked for their husbands, women who were, nice. That's a very gender coded word in the Christian church, right? So and sweet right? So that's like how women are usually described. So, and that's who I wanted to be. And it's so interesting because I always felt kind of like an outsider because I wasn't those women. So I never cared about sewing or quilting. I've actually gotten into cooking more now, but I wasn't when I was young. I wasn't very fashion forward. So I wasn't these things, but I wanted to be those things. And so that's something that has been positive about my rejection of gender norms, is that now I can embrace who I am and I can say quilting. Like, I will never care about that. I don't think it's interesting. And I do want to be a supportive partner, but I do not want to be that traditional girlfriend and or wife where I kind of, just put up with my partner and cook for them and, I don't know, let them come home and then give them silence for an hour, et cetera, these kinds of traditional. I've really embraced this idea that I'm not ever going to be that woman.
That's funny. I am, in some ways, a lot like that. But no. I'm not. I definitely have like a lot more complexity. But right now, I'm a stay-at-home mom. And so I do actually a lot of those feminine roles, including giving my partner space when he gets home. I do some things that are against my current value system, but that's you got to work through that. But anyway, I guess I'll talk a little bit about my loss of values or my gain of values, whatever you want to call it. I found for me that losing my values was one of the hardest things I did, especially since I never really felt like I had a relationship with God. So I didn't lose that friendship with God that a lot of people lose, or at least that Heather has lost. I think that stability was one of the main stabilities of my life. My childhood was mediumly stable. And I want to say that because there are vastly harder childhoods out there, homeless ones. But then there are childhoods that are, really put together. And I've seen the spectrum, and I'm definitely in the middle to low end of that spectrum. And so my childhood wasn't stable, and my relationship with God wasn't stable, but my relationship with my friends and that value system was pretty stable. It's really easy to feel a consistent sense of guilt when when the rules are right in front of you, and I'm not saying it was all bad. Of course, some of the values are, so there were certainly some that I never worried about. But abstinence, celibacy, like that one, well, at least to the extreme that we experienced it in our school, was one that I was not so great about. But I mean, granted, I only made out with boys until I was 19. So it was certainly, my guilt was a little bit unfounded.
Can I interject for a minute, Christine? I want to say, sure. Just to add, one of the funny things about what you just said is that this is one of the reasons why you and I weren't close friends in high school, because for me, I was quite scandalized by the fact that you were making out with boys. So it's just funny how now we're such close friends. But Christine and I were not very close. We weren't enemies or anything, but we just weren't particularly close during this time in our lives.
Yeah, no. I think any closeness we had I think we're pretty intellectual even at the time. And so I think we did connect there, but other ways we were pretty different. Granted, I'm sure you still saw my penitence.
That's true.
You know what I mean? And so I think that was important probably for the younger kids, to see the fact that I still like my senior year, I was still there. I was still trying to be in God's good grace, But anyway, so I had this stable set of values, and even though I wasn't great at keeping some of them, it was still there, and it was still something I could rely on. And so when I deconverted, I was struck by this sense of vastness of morality. It could either be, you could go in so many different directions. I mean, even if you look at the different religions, each set of values is so different. I mean, there are definitely some cores, not murdering, trying to be kind, I think, is in many of the religions, whether you're kind to the earth or kind to people. But it's so different. There's so much out there. And then I felt really empty too, because I was like, how do you do this? How do you start from nothing, from no sense of good and evil? I can't, anytime I would feel, my gut would feel like, toward or against some specific value, it would be rooted in Christianity. And it would be like, wait, no, like that's not me. That's not where I want to start. So I had to basically erase all of the ideas that I had in Christianity. It was really tough. I mean, train up a child in the way they should go, and when they're old, they'll not depart from it, is one of the truest statements I feel in the Bible. It's really hard to rent yourself from your childhood values. So I thought about the most basic things, like, okay, what is evil? Is evil? Is evil evil? Where do people sort of get their values, their secular value system? And I know humanism is sort of surrounding this now, because it's not that secular people are without values. We sort of live with a social code of ethics, that works really well, or works not so great, but has been at least consistent. But when you change from Christianity to that secular code, it's not as concrete. You have all these crazy laws that our government has put forth, and and you're like, okay, are laws my morals? No, not really. That's not what should motivate you to live your daily life, because you're likely not gonna break those laws, so fine. Do I want to follow those gender roles that Heather and I were talking about? What do I want? How do I want to interact with people? How do I want to treat my rearing of my child, my inner relationships with new partners? That's so huge. It's you could go completely into the selfish world and be like, no, I'm living in the now for me, because I don't have a God anymore. So I can do what I want as long as it doesn't really harm people. But, is that who I really want to be? I don't know. Which I do kind of know now, because I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. What's nice, I think, and Heather hasn't necessarily reached this, is, I'm going on year 11 of not being a Christian, or at least of knowing that I was severely doubting. And that's how old I'm. Very old, everybody. And so I've had a lot of time to think about this, and even though my values are still developing, I finally feel like I don't have to question myself all the time about whether or not what I'm doing is right or wrong. One of my biggest values actually stems from when I was a little girl, when I was a Christian. I believed, so, everyone who was a Christian sort of knows the story of Solomon and how he asked for wisdom from God. And I always used to think, okay, what would I ask for? And I realized that I would ask God to see people the way that he sees them. Because I think this Godhead that we had when we were kids did look purely into people, did look on the heart. He saw their intentions and their meekness and their pride and, evaluates them in that way. And that's how I want to see people now. So even though I don't have this Godhead anymore, I still have this idea that if he did exist, he or she did exist, that they would look at people for who they really are. And I'd like to treat people sort of with that purity, with that, you know what, maybe you said the wrong thing, or maybe you have some weird idiosyncrasies, but I'm going to try to look at you, maybe the way your mother would. And so I think that's really important in the way that I treat people. And kindness is also really important to me. I think I value it a lot when I just see people in their day-to-day be kind to each other. Not necessarily the outgoing kindness that, I value certainly doctors who go overseas and take care of people for very little money or no money. I definitely value that. But the real kindness, the day-to-day kindness, I feel is something that I value really highly, because I do think that you can really build someone up by just being kind to them. And then mindfulness is also really important to me, just being aware of people around you and aware of yourself. I find I go through these cycles of mindfulness where I'm very introvertedly mindful, and I think a lot about myself and who I am and what mistakes I've made or am making currently. And then I go through these stages where I don't really notice myself, and I'm looking at the people around me, thinking about what their intentions are and their motivations. But that for me is a strong value, because I think that keeping that awareness also leads to kindness, and it also leads to seeing people the way, the fundamentalist God sees them. So I have sort of this, it's strange, but it is sort of rooted in my Christianity, and I'm not ashamed of that. I'm pretty proud to say that my values are based on something that seems like it's going in the right direction. Granted, there isn't a commandment in the Bible that says see people the way God sees them. So it is my own, but I am still really grateful that I had that in my upbringing so that I could adapt it. Now, at least the story of Solomon, I'm grateful for the story of Solomon.
Right. I just wanted to add to what you were saying, or to respond to what you were saying, because I think it's really beautiful. And I think you're expressing something that, again, there isn't a lot of, we don't hear this very often in our culture. We in deconversion narratives, we tend to hear God is really a judgmental God. And so therefore Christians are really judgmental people. And, now that I'm not a Christian, I'm so laid back and I'm so not judgmental. And, there is truth to that, of course, to some extent. But what I think, Christine, you're especially expressing that's really important is that it's a lot more complicated than that, because there is the Christian, that's what's interesting about Christianity, is there are kind of different versions of God. So there is like the vindictive, judgmental God in the Bible. There are elements of that, but there's also a God, like you're suggesting, a God that is a God of true love, and that's how you and I were raised, certainly. And I think that's another thing our church did well, is we didn't get a lot of the hellfire. We did sometimes, but I think it was less the hellfire, judgmental God, and more of we did have a concept of God as being loving and seeing people seeing the beauty in people. And so I think what you're expressing is really beautiful, and which is that you're, this idea that you're proud that that's influenced you. And yeah.
Oh, and you were saying, and it was true love. The judgment of God actually came from more not having a fear of God than it from our from what we were taught. It was sort of, if you don't have a fear of God, that's when you lose your way. So I don't think they really based it in that judgmental way that some people picture it. And I think some people who listen to this might have a paradigm shift about Christianity. Maybe, I'm hoping, because it's not all bad. Definitely not. So it's funny. I was just thinking about how we sort of are the good girl and the bad girl of our school.
Yes.
And that's really funny that we've come together in this way. This sort of that good versus bad was definitely divided in our school, and it's just crazy that we're here.
And it's
together.
so funny too how and like the roles have shifted in some ways. I think now you're a much kinder person than me. I'm trying to get better, and I think you're a good influence on me. But it's just interesting that shifted. Like you're like what you were just expressing. This idea, that's something I struggle with. I still tend to be very judgmental of people, especially people I don't know very well. And so one of the things that I take inspiration from, and even in our conversations, you will do this, and I really like when I'll say something and you'll say, well, I'll say something about somebody that's sort of more of a black and white, judgmental, way of understanding them, and then you will sort of push back and say, well, maybe have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? And so it's just interesting that the good girl and bad girl, because really the good girl and bad girl dichotomy for us was really to do with sexual, I suppose, like sexual sins more than anything else. And so it's just interesting that I think the reality is that you're now, in terms of now our moral codes, like you're in many ways like someone that I want to be more like.
Oh, so thank you. That's really sweet. I would never say that about myself. Of course, I see myself as pretty flawed, but it's nice to hear that. Thank you. And additionally, there isn't really good girl, bad girl anymore. We're sort of, those lines have blurred, and now we're living in a place, both of us, where it's okay to be a little bad. And it's not gender defining to be a little sweet, to be a little good. Now we can embrace those things just as who we are, instead of this dichotomous difference that we used to have in our faith. And I love that. I think that's really the beauty of losing your value systems. You get to rebuild in a way that makes you authentic and unique and set apart. And you're not part of a community that follows the 10 Commandments or follows those kind of things. You're just you. And that, I think, is really special.
Yes, well said. We hope you enjoyed today's podcast. We would like to thank our friends from Twitter, Godless Iowan, Mrs. Snarky, Godless Journey, and the anonymous woman who provided us with the insightful reflections that you heard at the beginning of this podcast. And we would also like to extend a huge thank you to all of you, our listeners. We are truly grateful for your support. If you would like to contact us, you may email us at forsakingfaith@gmail.com or look us up on Twitter and Facebook at Forsaking Faith. Please be sure to subscribe to our podcast, and we would also appreciate it if you would leave us a review so that more people can find us.
Stay tuned as we wrap up this episode with our artistic segment, which we hope will further inspire you as you reflect on what you've just heard.
Out of the abyss and into the other abyss. I was a hollow woman. I'd always wondered why God never noticed me. Why his nearest and dearest disciples of the church never noticed me. We struggle as youth to be noticed by our parents, our peers, our pedagogues, but God should see us, right? I was 13. I said, God, if you see me, if you know me, please, you know my heart, please show me. He didn't. God knows my heart, and he didn't show me anything. So I racked my brain for years. Why not me, God? Why don't I see it? Then I thought, oh wait, Thomas, doubting Thomas, he saw. Yet he still had trouble believing. That freaking guy who made Jesus say, blessed are those is me, who have not seen yet still believe. That was me, right? I didn't see a damn thing. Yet I stood there for fear of doubting, and I believed God, Christ specifically, was my Savior. I was blessed, right? University, the time when our minds are open, vulnerable, begging for knowledge, was when I realized God was God, and I was me. My story is longer, deeper, more complex, but these seeds of doubt, of faith without reason, made me who I am today, right? For all that, I'm grateful. But then I realized me was me. I had no values, no moral compass, no guide, no teacher, no foundation. Hell, I had no consequences, no limitations, no structures. That was cool, but I was kind of still lost. Now I have one or two answers, and that's okay, for this is how my faith ended, not with a bang, but a whimper.